Almost every version of Star Trek manages to include one thing, even if it's just a name drop or a passing mention, and I'm not talking about Spock or phasers or even the Federation. It's a not-so-little ship called the Enterprise. Right now, Strange New Worlds is introducing a whole new generation of fans to the very first version of the Enterprise, years before James T. Kirk would ever drop into the captain's chair, and it's doing it in what is Star Trek's 60th anniversary year. But how much do we actually know about the ship? Not the characters that live on it, not the adventures they had, but the actual vessel itself that this iconic franchise is centered on. I bet even the hardcore fans would need to look up the wiki or dust off their Star Trek encyclopedias, so today we're going to dissect the anatomy and lore of the USS Enterprise. Where was the USS Enterprise actually built, and why is its origin more complicated than it looks? Let's start with the basics. The USS Enterprise, registered as NCC 1701, was a Constitution-class starship. It was constructed at the San Francisco Fleet Yards on Earth and then launched on the 11th of April, 2245. Its first commanding officer was Captain Robert April, who oversaw the component construction and trial runs, with his wife, Sarah, being the ship's first chief medical officer, and a young Christopher Pike, his first officer. An old production Bible called The Making of Star Trek answers a fairly common question about whether the starship was built on the ground or in orbit, and it's actually both. The Enterprise was built on Earth, but assembled in space. So far, so simple, right? Except, of course, nothing about this ship is actually simple, and the complexity is half the fun, because that's how you know just how much time and energy was devoted to the creation of the Enterprise, both on-screen and off. Even something basic, like is this the first Federation ship named Enterprise, has a complicated answer. The 1701 is technically the second Starfleet vessel to be called Enterprise because a century earlier, there was the Enterprise NX-01, Jonathan Archer's ship. But then the issue is that the NX-01 predates the Federation itself by a decade, so whether that actually counts is up to you. Then there's the size issue, which has been pretty much unresolved since the beginning. Early planning had the ship at roughly 540 feet, with a crew of around 200, which is small for a ship, which was why designer Matt Jeffries, who thought this was too cramped for a ship going into deep space for years, doubled it to more than 1,000 feet. Surprise, surprise, now the problem was that it was too damn big. The compromise ultimately landed at 947 feet, but the crew number was never fully settled, which we'll get into later. Even a franchise-defining starship never got its most basic numbers fixed, which frankly opens up the space for a lot of fan answers and fan fiction. What class of starship is the Enterprise, and what made the Constitution class the backbone of the fleet? Okay, so I mentioned that the Enterprise is a Constitution-class starship, and now I'll explain why. Constitution-class starships are a line of at least a dozen Class 1 heavy cruisers built for exactly one job over everything else: long-range, deep space exploration. They're not warships, which matters more than people think. So what do I mean by heavy cruiser? Well, in Star Trek terms, it's not a battleship, it's more of a jack-of-all-trades explorer vehicle with weapons enough to protect itself. These ships were built with 14 science laboratories for a large crew and had the endurance to operate alone for years on end without ever seeing another starship. Getting posted to such a ship was the highest privilege. They also carried enough firepower and enough shielding to survive a first contact that went wrong or to stand their ground against a hostile power, but their armament was to keep the crew alive long enough to get home, not to go charging off into battle. During the Klingon War in the late 2250s, Starfleet actually kept the Constitution-class ships away from the front lines, making them a last resort instead of throwing them right into the fray from the get-go. And another thing, the Enterprise didn't become Starfleet's flagship because of its classification. Its sister ships, the Constellation, the Defiant, the Excalibur, the Intrepid, the Lexington, and some others, were built to the exact same specifications, but most met catastrophe. The Defiant vanished into an interphase pocket, the Exeter lost its entire crew to a virus, and the Constellation was destroyed by a planet-killing weapon. The Enterprise earned its reputation the hard way, through service, and also because of the damn near impossible survival rate of the crew under Captain Kirk. The class became legendary largely because this one ship survived, and how. How big is the Enterprise, and how many people actually live and work aboard it? Back to basics, by which I mean measurements. the long-standing official figure has the Enterprise at 947 feet, with the widest part, aka the saucer section, being about 417 feet across. The original filming model, which is in the Smithsonian now, proves that number correct, as does that production Bible, The Making of Star Trek. Clearly, it's a pretty big ship, and the best way to know this isn't from numbers or even on screen, but by comparison. Back in the very first season of the original series, lovingly nicknamed TOS, a freighter captain looks at the Enterprise beside his own little vessel and its crew of 20 and describes her as like a whole city in space. So that's the image to keep in mind when you're thinking of how big the Enterprise is. A floating city with over 400 people living, working, sleeping, and occasionally getting into shit tons of trouble aboard it. Back to the crew question, the answer is, well, it's a range, not a fixed figure. In Pike's earlier era, it was said to be about 200, but by the time of Kirk's command, the standard figure is 430. Kirk himself once specified 428 to be exact. I'm not going to tell you that one of those numbers is the correct number because, the way I see it, that number's probably shifted across the ship's in-universe career and across 60 years of behind-the-scenes productions. Like during Pike's time, they didn't have a 5-year mission to go where no one had ever been before. They were generally in more familiar territory, so they needed fewer hands on deck. Logical, right? How does the Enterprise actually travel faster than light? Now, here's where we get really technical. Scotty would love this part if he were here with us now. Let's get down to brass tacks, though. How does this dang ship outrun light itself? The answer, of course, is warp drive, and I'll try to explain that as simply as I can because this isn't an engineering class. At the heart of the ship, we have a regulated matter/antimatter reaction between deuterium, which is a heavy isotope of hydrogen, and antideuterium. This reaction is generally impossible to control, which is where the franchise's most famous mineral comes in, dilithium crystals. They very uniquely remain non-reactive with antimatter when they're bombarded with a high-frequency electromagnetic field, and this lets them stay in the middle of the reaction and mediate it, channeling the resulting plasma out to the engines. Oh, and dilithium is fictional, before you start Googling it. Following this, the engines generate a warp field, which is like a bubble of distorted space-time that wraps around the ship, and here we get to something you might not know. The Enterprise doesn't actually accelerate through space faster than light, because they might just tear a hole in physics. Instead, it warps space around itself and pretty much surfs over that distortion, which makes sure that the relativity stays intact even as the ship crosses distances with a cheap trick. Now, we get to the propulsion systems. There are 3 working together. The warp nacelles, these 2 long cylinders held on struts that we see Scotty fantasizing about in Star Trek 2009, handle the faster-than-light travel. The impulse engines, powered by the fusion, handle everything below light speed, which means your usual maneuvering around a planet or a starbase. And the reaction control thrusters handle the finer parts of positioning so the ship can be pointed exactly where it needs to face. One quick thing I want to point out, notice how those nacelles are mounted way out away from the main body of the ship? Well, that's not just for aesthetic reasons. The designer correctly assumed that the matter-antimatter reaction was something that could be incredibly lethal, so he deliberately put the engines at a distance from the crew and made sure they could be jettisoned entirely in an emergency. Basically, it was a safety decision. What keeps the ship alive day to day? Power, life support, and the Jeffries tubes. Sure, warp drive is fun stuff, but when a mission goes on for 5 years, you rely on the boring stuff, by which I mean life support, recycling air and water, and artificial gravity holding everything down, and of course, the impulse and auxiliary power systems keeping the lights on, plus the sensors humming when the ship's still. These aren't glamorous aspects of the Enterprise, but they are very necessary because if you don't have all of them, this exploration vessel is basically a very expensive coffin. This brings us to something pretty iconic about Star Trek ships, but something that's rarely talked about in fandom circles: the Jeffries tubes. These are the maintenance crawl spaces, really narrow access shafts between decks and behind the walls. So, when there's a crisis, a crew member, by which I mean almost always Scotty, has to physically climb into the ship's insides and get hands-on with whatever's there. Wiring, plumbing, power conduits, all of that. The reason for this was so that the important machinery was right outside the hull and accessible, so nobody ever had to spacewalk outside the ship, be it for a routine repair or while the ship was under attack. Also, fun fact, these tubes are named after a real person, Matt Jeffries, the art director of TOS. It started as a nickname among the production crew for the reused corridor set, but then Jeffries himself began writing the term into his blueprints and plans. This name wasn't actually spoken out loud on screen until The Next Generation, decades later, but it came right from the original show, show. There's also a running gag about a lot of pipework on set being labeled GNDN, and everybody on set knew that stood for goes nowhere, does nothing, but hey, as long as it looks cool, right? How does the Enterprise defend itself? Just because it's not a warship doesn't mean the Enterprise is defenseless. There are three main systems. First, the deflector shields, energy barriers projected around the hull that absorb or turn aside incoming fire. They can be raised and lowered on command, and their integrity can be checked from the command deck in-universe, making it something to check obsessively during a fight. That's why shields at 60%, usually spoken by Sulu or Chekhov, is one of the most repeated lines in the entire franchise in pretty much every show and movie, because the state of the shields is basically the health bar for everyone on the ship and the ship itself. If those shields go down to zero, well, this isn't really a video game, so no respawns. Second, everyone's favorite, phasers. Directed energy weapons that are adjustable across a huge range, set to stun and set to kill being the main options. They're the equivalent of a handgun for the Federation and those aboard the Enterprise. These are matter-antimatter warheads launched at range. They carry a seriously destructive punch, and it becomes clear why, because later Trek media establishes that each one is made up of 1.5 kilos of antimatter. If you know anything about antimatter, hell, even if you don't know anything about it, that's a terrifying amount. So between these three weapon systems, the Enterprise can definitely hold its own against almost anything the galaxy throws at it, which is pretty impressive considering that it was never ever designed to be a warship. How does the transporter actually work, and why did the crew consider it risky? The transporter is maybe the single most famous piece of Star Trek technology, and everyone in the fandom is so used to it that we don't really think about how friggin' scary it must have been at the start. The idea behind the iconic transporter is pretty simple, but that doesn't mean it's not freakishly unsettling. You might think that the transporter just takes a person or an object and delivers them to a second location, but what actually happens is that it converts them into an energy pattern, holds that pattern briefly in what's called a buffer, beams it across space, and reconstitutes it at the far end. Matter to energy and back again in just a couple seconds. But what does that really mean? Well, the transporter basically unmakes you into nothing and then fixes you up again somewhere else. Just imagine if there was even the tiniest error in that process. Thankfully, the show is fully honest about how nerve-wracking that is, because the crews on the starships are repeatedly shown to be wary of the thing. Characters state outright that they'd rather take a shuttle than get, in their words, scrambled, because the unease you feel about something maybe going wrong somewhere between the two pads is felt by every single person walking into the transporter room on screen. I've got a few examples to really push this point across. In the TOS episode, The Enemy Within, a contaminant on the pad splits Captain Kirk into two separate beings during the beam-up, one indecisive and gentle, one aggressive and violent. Plus, it also knocks out the transporter and strands a landing party in freezing temperatures. And then, in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, a transporter malfunction corrupts the patterns of two officers mid-transport, including a Vulcan science officer, and what comes back, well, to put it lightly, it doesn't survive. Later series add way worse stuff too. Merged crew members, people trapped in the buffer, and more. But even in the early days, the message was clear. This technology is astonishing, useful, and you should be a little scared of it. How alive is the Enterprise's own computer? Yup, the ship's got a brain, or at least sort of. The Enterprise runs on a centralized voice interactive computer core, which handles pretty much everything. Life support, navigation, sensors, records, all of it. And the crew can talk to it directly, as we know, so just think about how revolutionary a talking computer you could have a conversation with would have been back in 1966. But one thing I gotta point out, and this is especially important nowadays, this is a powerful voice-responsive computer system. It's not a sentient or self-aware artificial intelligence. Sure, Star Trek would eventually give us holographic crew members and AI personalities who are actually people, but the Enterprise's computer is most definitely not that. Keep that in mind. The show actually explored this misunderstanding in the episode The Ultimate Computer, where Starfleet installs an experimental system called the M5 to run the ship almost entirely on its own with a skeleton crew. Predictably, it goes catastrophically wrong, turning war games lethal and destroying another Federation starship before Kirk manages to talk it into shutting itself down. This whole episode is a deliberate warning about handing human judgment over to a machine, and considering the show is from the 1960s, it's eerily appropriate for today, what with the rise of AI over the last few years. On a lighter note though, in Tomorrow is Yesterday, the ship's computer comes back from a refit with an unexpectedly flirtatious personality and starts calling Kirk dear, much to his horror. That's probably the only time he didn't flirt back in 60 years. What is the Enterprise's most legendary mission in Star Trek history? 60 years of Star Trek means more missions than I can count, so let's do this properly. A couple of honorable mentions first, then the one that blows everything else out of the water and takes the crown. Honorable mention number 1, the Doomsday Machine, where the Enterprise finds a planet-destroying weapon, a humongous automated device that's eating through inhabited worlds, and the ship is badly damaged trying to stop it. However, and this is something people get wrong sometimes, it's not actually the Enterprise that finally gets flown into the machine's mouth, it's the USS Constellation, the derelict sister ship, but it was piloted and ultimately detonated by Kirk to destroy the machine from the inside. The Constellation made the sacrifice, and so the Enterprise survives, like always. Honorable mention number 2, Balance of Terror, which had the Enterprise's first documented encounter with a cloaked Romulan warship. By fans and critics both, this is seen as one of the finest hours in TOS. It's a super tense submarine thriller-style cat-and-mouse face-off that also gave us the very first look at the Romulans and hinted at their shared ancestry with the Vulcans. But, in our opinion, the single most legendary moment involving the Enterprise? We're heading to the movies for that, and it's obviously the destruction of the Enterprise in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Crippled, outnumbered, and about to be infiltrated by a Klingon crew, Kirk makes the call no captain ever wants to make. He triggers the ship's self-destruct sequence to make sure no one ever gets the Enterprise, and then stands on the Genesis planet and watches his ship burn up in the atmosphere. When we think about it now, every truly great Enterprise moment is about the crew, but this one's about the ship itself. It's a sacrifice made of the Enterprise, and it's written exactly like the death of a beloved character. And it is, just one that's made of metal. Epic and heartbreaking all at once, pretty much everyone ranks this among the most iconic moments in the franchise's history. How many ships have actually carried this name? All right, so this is a lot of ships, so we're going to go through it in order, okay? First, the Enterprise NX-01. Earth's first Warp 5 starship under Captain Jonathan Archer, which operated a century before Kirk and also long before the United Federation of Planets. This was the ship that put humanity on the interstellar map and helped lay the groundwork for the Federation itself. Then, the star of the show, from 1966 to 2026, we've got the USS Enterprise NCC-1701, the Constitution-class ship that passed from April to Pike to Kirk, never once leaving the hearts of fans across decades. After its destruction, the crew is given the USS Enterprise A, another Constitution-class ship given the same famous name, which carries them through the second half of the original film series. The Enterprise B is an Excelsior-class ship launched in 2293 under Captain John Harriman, and it's on her disastrous maiden voyage in the opening of the film Generations that James T. Kirk is apparently lost and assumed dead. Then we've got the Enterprise C, which is another Ambassador-class ship, this time under Captain Rachel Garrett. It was destroyed while heroically defending a Klingon outpost from a Romulan attack, which, in the Next Generation episode, Yesterday's Enterprise, becomes the reason for a whole new altered timeline. The Enterprise D is the big Galaxy-class ship of the Next Generation, helmed by Captain Jean-Luc Picard, destroyed at Veridian 3 in Generations, although decades later, it's lovingly rebuilt and flies again in the third season of Picard. The Enterprise E is a sleeker Sovereign-class ship, also Picard's, the one from the Next Generation films, First Contact, Insurrection, and Nemesis. You're not going to see many fans talking about this one, but it is worth a mention, of course, just because it doesn't get destroyed immediately. The Enterprise F appears in Picard's third season under Admiral Elizabeth Shelby, leading the fleet's big Frontier Day celebration, only to be caught up in and destroyed during the Borg's assault. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Pretty much every new version of the Enterprise doesn't last even half as long as the original. And then we've got the Enterprise G, the newest of the line, a ship that was actually the USS Titan, renamed Enterprise in the Picard season finale, and handed to a newly promoted Captain 7 of 9. This is one of the few Enterprises that doesn't get annihilated on screen, at least not yet. In the modern Kelvin timeline films, starting with 2009's Star Trek, we've got a separate NCC-1701 built on a different origin in a different continuity. Same ship, same name, different universe, so technically this doesn't count for our prime timeline breakdown, although we gotta point this out, their Enterprise also gets destroyed in Star Trek Beyond from 2016, but that film ends with the construction of a new Enterprise, aka NCC-1701A, keeping the old traditions strong, I see. Who actually designed the Enterprise, and why does it look the way it does? Everything we talked about wouldn't exist without Matt Jeffries. Jeffries was an aviation illustrator and a Second World War veteran who'd flown in and worked on bombers. When he became the art director for TOS, Gene Roddenberry gave him one deceptively simple instruction: no flying saucers, no rockets, nothing like the cheap, conventional 1960s idea of a spaceship. What Jeffries arrived at, after working through enough designs to fill a book, was the now immortal saucer and nacelle silhouette. He also came up with the Klingon battlecruisers, and he had a hand in almost every techie design on TOS. The best part about Jeffries' design isn't about the looks, it's that he approached it with genuine engineering logic. The crew lives in the saucer portion. The dangerous power-generating nacelles are held way out on struts at a safe distance, and they're built to be ejected if things go wrong. He kept the hull smooth and the important machinery tucked inside, because he reasoned that critical systems shouldn't be left exposed to the hazards of deep space. Every line of that ship is a safety augment. Function first, beauty followed. Also, I know there's this unsolved mystery of the registry number, and I love this because it was never actually settled, even by the man himself. Jeffries actually gave more than one answer about why he chose 1701. One was that he wanted a number that was legible from a distance, so he removed the digits that were easy to confuse, ultimately leaving him with 1701. He also admitted it happened to be close to the registration number on his own aircraft, cheerfully never bothering to deny the rumor that the ship was named after his plane. Another answer was found on top of his own signed sketches, where he wrote that this was the 17th cruiser design, serial number 1, hence 1701. And then there's some who say Roddenberry himself came up with it. Some mysteries just have no answer. The Bermuda Triangle, the disappearance of the Malaysian flight, whether this world really should have ended in 2012, and why the hell the Enterprise is 1701. Sometimes it's better to just stop asking questions. How does Strange New Worlds show us a different version of this same ship? Well, that brings us all the way to the present, and this is for anyone who's found the fandom through modern Trek. Strange New Worlds is set aboard this exact ship, the same registry, NCC 1701, years before Captain Kirk took command. Instead, Captain Christopher Pike is in control, and it's a straight-up prequel to TOS, and the timing of its 4th season, which premiered on the 23rd of July and is running weekly till its finale in September, is absolutely perfect because it coincides with the 60th anniversary of the original series. Season 4 will be Strange New Worlds' penultimate season, with a 5th and final season already ordered to get us directly to TOS. The final season is just 6 episodes, and I'm pretty sure it's just to hand over the ship to James T. Kirk, played by Paul Wesley, who's a recurring character on the show now. Every single time I see Wesley interacting with Spock or Uhura or even Captain Pike, or even just walking the corridors of the ship he'll one day command, it just sends a tingle down my spine. Plus, in such a technical video, how could we not discuss the technical side of Strange New Worlds? The show renders the ship with a level of detail that 1966 practical sets and physical models couldn't dream of. Okay, so yeah, the production did make the vessel considerably larger than the classic 947-foot figure, but it is unmistakably the same ship, the same basic shape, the same saucer and nacelles, the same logic that Matt Jeffries established way back when, because there's some things you just don't mess with, unless you want fans from 6 different decades attacking you. So I think this is the perfect note to end on, because it goes right back to where we started. A perfect circle. This is the same ship that first flew across a television screen on the 8th of September 1966, and Season 4 will be airing its final episodes when we get to that momentous date. 60 years, and the Enterprise is still flying. So there you have it, folks. The anatomy of a ship. 60 years after it changed television and sci-fi history, Strange New Worlds is still finding brand new stories to tell aboard the iconic Enterprise. So now that we've mapped out the ship itself, let me know down in the comments. Should we dissect the anatomy of other Enterprise ships, or should we boldly get into the real-world USS Enterprise that started this whole naming tradition in the first place? Or maybe we should just head for the sci-fi multiverse and into the anatomy of other famous spaceships. There's a lot of scope, guys, and we'd love some input from you on what sort of videos we make next, so